Well, welcome everyone. We hope that interested voters in the Northwest Hills area that are and other Austinites who care about representation on City Council enjoy and find value in this conversation. We're joined by City Council candidate Marc Duchen. Cleo and I are going to offer these kind of Zoom conversations with City Council candidates ahead of the November election, given the importance of policy making at the city level. And as many people know, Cleo and I started Save Austin Now, I don't know, 5 or so years ago. We did it with the belief that a nonpartisan organization that would focus solely on quality of life issues was desperately needed. And we're proud to have built the largest grassroots organization in the history of Austin. Marc, why don't we just start by asking you to introduce yourself and talk about your background and why you're choosing to run for City Council.
Thanks first for having me, Matt and Cleo. So a bit of brief background. One of the reasons I'm running, really the main reason I'm running is because I care deeply about this district and the city. I've lived in the district for 24 years, lived in the city for 28 years. And a enormous trend that I've seen that really has troubled and frustrated not just me, but many folks I know is that we are just not being heard very much at City Hall. We're not being heard on land use issues. We're not being heard on spending issues. We're not being heard on safety issues. As you touched on a moment ago, not a lot of issues that affect our day-to-day quality of life. And so trying to make sure that we've got a city where we are heard and our voice matters, and a lot of those critical issues that do impact us, I think is paramount and a big part of why I chose to run. And from there, there's just a lot of other local and other city issues that I think I got involved with, everything from land use to parkland to public safety being a big one that I hear from voters all the time. We've got a lot of big challenges ahead of us, big and immediate challenges, and I wanted to make sure that there was somebody running that could hit the ground running and didn't require X amount of months or years of training and preparation. I've been involved in a lot of those city issues for many years. I've got over 2 decades of experience working in politics and advocacy and technology, and most recently running a business for the last 8 years, plus another decade of experience in the civic space on various boards, on my HOA board, on the Austin Neighborhood Council Executive Committee. And so I've been exposed to and worked on a lot of projects involving these issues that we've just talked about. And I feel like I'm the only candidate in this race that could really hit the ground running to make sure that we are tackling those issues, because there is a real immediacy. I think people are struggling to stay in this town. I think they are thinking about what the future of Austin is and whether that includes them or not. And I want to make sure that we've got a city where everybody can stay and live in and work in, whether they're essential workers, whether they're folks that have lived here for 20, 30, 40 years, multi-generational, whether they're folks that just got here a year or two ago. I want to make sure that we've got a city that can support and include everybody.
Absolutely. Cleo, why don't you start? Yeah.
What feedback have you heard, Marc, from talking to your neighbors or community members about the homelessness crisis, and what ideas do you have that will make it more solvable, more of an issue that the city council can address? Because obviously we're not in the right direction. We're worse off than we were 4 or 5 years ago when Matt and I met. In many respects, we do have a law and also a Supreme Court ruling that backs up what we've always believed all along. But what feedback have you gotten?
It's interesting because certainly public safety tops the list when I'm actually out on the streets talking to voters. And that's not necessarily violent crime, but it's, everything from graffiti and package theft. And obviously homelessness is one that comes up. I talked to somebody the other day that there was, they were woken up at 4 a.m. because somebody was rifling through their neighbor's dumpster, and it's just them and their mom and their duplex. And, they're concerned about their safety. We had a board meeting at my HOA last month where for the first time in 10 years, I heard a story where somebody found somebody that was sleeping out of their car in our parking lot and using the hose from one of our buildings for hygiene purposes. We've never had that.
Are they aware of the staffing crisis when you talk to community members of it being historic and the inability to recruit and the lack of a police contract? Do they connect the dots to why there isn't a police presence that could probably alleviate a lot of these concerns?
I think there's some awareness. I don't think there's full awareness around the contract and the details and the scope that you're talking about of how deep that shortage is, how significant it is. But I think there is some awareness because they don't see that presence anymore. And I give some examples. When I talk to folks in my area, we used to have a cop almost stationed daily in the morning out on Splash Springs Road, trapping people or ticketing or enforcing the speed limit, going downhill every single day. You knew he'd be there. You knew if you traveled to Mopac, you were going to slow down because there was going to be a cop there. It was reliable. We haven't seen that person there for 4 years. We used to have a district rep here at our part of Austin in Baker sector, and those district reps were cut. There used to be 8 per sector. They finally brought them back. We've got 3 now per sector. But for a period of 3 or 4 years during COVID, they were gone. And so we had nobody to turn to for directed patrols. We had nobody to turn to for evaluating our security. There was no resource. And so I think that's the awareness people have, but they don't know the details. I don't think they're they're aware of the details of the contract and the details around that and the scope. And that's part of where I think visiting with voters is helpful, that I can start to, if they're curious about it, inform them. But I think there is a bit of a disconnect, and I think we could do a better job of informing folks exactly where we are regarding our public safety shortage.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just so that people are all working off the same information, and I mean this more for the audience than for our conversation, but we were at 1,800 officers when Cleo and I started this, and we're now around 1,300 or 1,350 available officers. And when you add all the vacancies in and the cut positions, you're basically 500 down. The reason that you had no district reps and that there's no one doing traffic enforcement is not because the police don't care. It's because they don't have enough human beings doing this work. And while it is true that defund the police only lasted for 1 year, first of all, it only lasted for 1 year because the state legislature passed a law that made it impossible for it to continue. I believe it would have continued. But that blew open a hole in the budget and in the staffing situation that we've actually not only not repaired, it's actually only gotten bigger. We've been losing on average, Cleo's heard me mention this stat 1,000 times, 15 officers a month to attrition every single month on average now for 5 years. We're gaining, 30, 40 officers a year when a cadet class goes through a 6 to 8 month course instruction period, a 1 to 2 month field instruction period, and then their, whatever it is, 90-day or so initial phase. You're only getting 30, 40, maybe at best 60 a year, and you're losing at 15 a month, 180 a year. So it really is just a math problem. And so, Cleo rightly points out that the police contract is a huge problem. Thankfully, they've been negotiating. They appear to be close. We hope that really gets brought home quickly. We have a new police chief that we're excited about that was voted in on a unanimous basis, Lisa Davis, who starts really almost any day now, and she's already back here in Austin. So I guess as you look at public safety, I realize there's a lot of facets to this, and not everyone has to agree on everything, but the staffing crisis for us really is foundational. Have you thought much about this? Have you done ride-alongs? Have you talked to the police union? Have you talked to the fire union, the EMS union? Cleo and I have a tough time understanding why anyone who cares about our city would ever do anything that would work against our first responders from a policy standpoint. But the sad reality is we do have people on council who have worked to undermine them at times, including, in fact, I would argue the person that you're seeking to replace, Allison Alter. But let's set that aside. But talk about what you've learned from first responders and what you think we need to do.
Well, certainly one thing I was going to mention that you just touched on was it's not just a police problem. It's a problem across the board for all first responders. Yep. When I was doing my fire ride-along last week, one of the stats that they mentioned was there was a gentleman there that an officer that had joined about 10 years ago. And when he joined, there were about 4,000 applicants for about 125 positions. A more recent officer who's on probation, which is hasn't served long enough to be a fully serving officer. When he joined, he said it was about 400 applicants for about 200 positions. When I talked to Chief Nix, he said it could have been between 8 and 1,200, depending on how you classify it. But the bottom line is, at that trajectory, regardless of which one it is, that's not a trajectory we want to pursue. That's a trajectory where you're starting to no longer have a really professional fire force, where you're getting people that, may just want to, you're not getting the best of the best, which is where I think we've been very fortunate to have a lot of great officers now. They're kind of the Swiss Army knife for emergency services, which is another lesson I learned last week, which is to say, when you are getting routed through dispatch and you're not exclusively or expressly a police or an EMS call, you get routed to fire, and they're out there, helping old ladies up and taking care of every emergency and unlocking a door or whatever it is. And we're going to lose a lot of that flexibility and a lot of that professionalism at the rate that we're going. And I know one stat Chief Nix talks about also, or not Chief Nix, Bob Nix, the union president at AFD, is over time, the percentage of general fund dollars that have gone towards police, fire, EMS have dropped from about 66 to 62%. And that, to me, is a reflection of our priorities also. And I'd like to see that restored, because I do feel like the city is in the business of providing excellent and efficient core city services, which includes police, fire, EMS, as well as libraries, parks, health and human services, and other things. That's where our energy and should be. And right now, that's been diluted. It's even been diluted. One of the things that's interesting that you can't even tell from looking at the budget is it's also been diluted from simply a general fund as a percentage of the total budget, right? So general fund is, X percent of the budget. About 8 or 9 years ago, it was about $1 billion out of about a $3.5 billion budget. Today, it's about 1.4 out of a $5.9 billion budget. So what that really means is, as a percentage of core city services, the general fund versus all spending, it's declined also. And to me, again, it's a reflection of our priorities and where we want to be as a city. And I'd like to see that reversed, because to me, that's what most people are depending on when they think of the city of Austin, showing up for emergency services and ice storms and everything else that we need to be doing to make sure people are safe and have access to, the right response at the right time.
And on homelessness, where do you think the city council is currently failing?
I think it's failing on a couple of fronts. One is, I think there's a general challenge of connecting dollars to outcomes. And you can see this.
Precisely.
You can see this in really, I often tell a story of two places. One is, you can see it in the audit that Mackenzie Kelly and Leslie Poole signed off on or sponsored 3 years ago, where it just talks about the money that was spent in a certain time frame, and it doesn't connect to what actually happened during that time frame. Where did the money go? Who was helped? System flow, beds, any of those details. And I think the second place is simply the Echo dashboard, which unfortunately was down for 3 or 4 years. It's back up this year, but when you look at it, it's looking at the opposite end. It's looking at system flow and beds. It's not connecting them to dollars. And so I think that's a huge part of the conversation that's missing. And maybe that's happening somewhere in the bowels of the Homeless Strategy Office. I don't know. But in terms of what we understand, the public, and potentially even policymakers at the city council and other places, we're not seeing that information. And so I think that's desperately needed, is to make sure that we understand, because the challenge that I have is, when you go back and look at the city's own reports from 2020, they hired national experts, Barbara Pape. And one of the things that's interesting about their report is you get to see the comparison of solutions as well as their cons. And so when you look at permanent supportive housing, which has been our real emphasis over the last 4 years with Finding Home ATX and the other projects the city's embarked on, that's an incredibly expensive solution. The numbers that are in that report don't even count capital costs, which are very significant for Austin. And you're talking about a solution that's 3 times as expensive as prevention. It's 5 times as expensive as a shelter bed. It's an expensive solution. If it's not well managed, and one of the things about that report and other reports that's really interesting also about permanent supportive housing beds is it's really best utilized. It's most efficient when it's utilized on chronically homeless individuals that have comorbidities. Why? Because they consume more resources in the healthcare system and the criminal justice system. again, there's no information that I can find that we're actually using PSH beds for that purpose. So I think making sure that we are triaging and prioritizing in that way is an important piece also. A model that I really like is in Houston called New Hope Housing. It's a nonprofit. They've been in operation for 25 years. What's interesting to me about them is a couple of things. One is they, first of all, will take anybody. The only requirement you've got to stay there is to sign the paperwork to apply for the federal housing tax credits that pay for operations. But they raise money privately to fund their essentially multi-campus permanent supportive housing operation. So they've got like, I think probably 10 or 11 facilities right now, each with 100, 200 people. That's total about 1,600 beds. I think they're have about, maybe 500 or 600 coming online the next year or two. So it's a very big operation. I mean, 4 years ago when the city was getting into the PSH business, they were larger than the entire city's PSH supply as one nonprofit in Houston. So they know what they're doing. They've got the experience. They know how to build a facility, single point of entry and exit, the materials to use to make sure that they last. All of those details they figured out over 25 years. And one of my frustrations while working on this issue was, again, talking to council 4 years ago and being pointed to the Terrace at Oak Springs facility. It's right, it's catty cross from Integral Care. It's a good location. It's serving homeless veterans. It's got 50 beds. That was their success story. It's harder to replicate that when you're building up facilities that are 20 plus minutes away, that are in food deserts and transit deserts, and that's what the city embarked on. And so there's all kinds of things that we could be learning from these other programs that have been successful in other places that for some reason we have chosen not to. And I would love to adopt that program. And another reason I like it is because it's friendly on taxpayers. It's friendly on local taxpayers, right? They're not asking City of Houston residents to support them. They're asking the philanthropic community to get involved, which is what I think we can always do a better job here in Austin. And they're asking, obviously, the federal government to pay for operations, which is federal housing tax credits. And one last point I'll make is when you look at Finding Home ATX, which is the prior mayor's program for trying to address homelessness, a $515 million initiative that was going to build a lot of PSH beds. Again, it's kind of, from what I can tell, been a limbo for over a year now, well over a year now. We don't know if they've fully funded the program yet. And the biggest challenge with that program that I saw was, and you mentioned this earlier, Matt, a math problem. When you look at how it was the last projection I ever saw, which I think was about a year and a half ago, they were going to spend the $550 million within 3 years. By year 3, they were going to have $106 million in operational costs. And so anybody that's ever budgeted or understands how programs work is going to be able to ask, well, what the heck happens in year 4? You haven't raised the money, the $550 million to begin with, to complete the program. And now you're saddling the city in this project with $106 million of operational costs. Where's that? I mean, that's 1/14 of the entire general budget. So there are just a lot of math problems to figure out regarding our approach to homelessness.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It gives me two follow-ups. I know Cleo will be interested in too. First is Mayor Watson, our current mayor, expressed a desire in going beyond the internal audit that McKenzie and Leslie Poole put together and doing a performance audit, an outside performance audit with a focus on mental health outcomes. My understanding is they put an RFP together, but in order to even send out the RFP, they had to have 4 co-sponsors and couldn't get 4 co-sponsors. I can tell by your laugh that I imagine our alignment on the desire and the need for a performance audit that is an outside audit that tracks outcomes to the point that you raised is something that you would support.
Absolutely. I think, frankly, more of that is needed across the board. And, one thing I'm hoping to take to council is something of a business background, which I think is in some cases missing or at least deficient on our current council.
Oh, no doubt.
How do you have metrics and KPIs and reviews and understanding, are things working in 6 months or a year or 5 years? We're spending money on these different projects. I mean, look, in our agenda on last week's council meeting, there were, over 200 items. A lot of them were on the consent agenda. Many of them were $1 million items. And I'm just wondering who's tracking all of that. Where is that? Is council do they have an eye on where that money is being spent and is it creating value for people? I mean, that's our job. That's our core job. And anybody serving on a board would know that we are out there to create value for people and make sure that if you're stewards of other people's money, that we are generating value for it. And one thing that we may differ on is I've got no problem spending money. I just want to make sure that it does something valuable for people and serves them. And if we don't have evidence to support that, if we're not constantly reviewing and having a feedback loop or metrics or one thing that I know the mayor has even talked about previously, the Sunset Commission that works at the municipal level to find out whether programs are being effective and to retire obsolete ones. I think all of those things are valuable things for us to talk about and try and advocate for, because I do feel like, look, I'll give you one data point. And again, I apologize for nerding out here, but one thing that's missing in the budget, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is historicals, right? When most people looking at a budget are going to be looking at budgets and actuals going back X amount of years to figure out where we are, where we came from, and how we go forward, what's creating value and what's not. That, my understanding, was pulled out of the budget years ago. And so there's no way to tell. I mean, think about it from your water bill, right? You look at your water bill and you're like, wow, I spent so much more this year than last year. What's going on? That actually happened to us, by the way, at our HOA, right? We looked at it about 7 years ago. There was a big spike. It turned out we went to go work with Allison's office and Austin Water and discovered we were being overbilled for something called the fire demand meter, which serves multifamily properties like ours. And we're saving $20,000 a year in water as our association. So that's about $150,000 by now. That's the kind of thing that, I'll be hopefully looking for at the city for those kind of opportunities. But that's where historicals are really valuable. I wouldn't have known that without them. When you go back and look at the historicals, and I pulled the budgets back to 2016, between 2016 and 2020, that 4-year window, our total budget increased roughly about 20% in that window. We plateaued, right? We cut spending basically for 1 year during COVID. And then between 2021 and 2025, our spending has increased 40% since then. So we're spending about double the rate. And admittedly, some of that is, land is worth more in Austin, and that's how property taxes are generated. But a lot of that's also increasing to the max allowed cap before a public vote. Part of that's utility transfers that are covering those. Part of that's increasing fees and permits. Part of that's making Austin less affordable for average people. And so we need that perspective on council, and we need that information to make smart decisions about how we move forward as a city and can plan better.
Yeah, it's pretty evident that is exactly what we're missing. We have a lot of, I feel, activists or people who come from a profession of campaigning and being a politician instead of having real life experiences running a business or understanding that part of it and how you should be doing things to benefit the community as a whole. I will add that Matt and I, from the beginning, when we got together to pass the citywide camping ban, when they lifted the camping ban, we felt that they did that without a plan, without safe campgrounds, without toilets, without security for individuals. They just basically pushed them off onto the streets for them to fend for themselves. Matt and I have always believed that there should be the priority should be on mental health and the drug addiction crisis. And we feel that qualifying all of that as a housing issue will not meet the outcome that we desperately need. We need to prioritize where the issue really lies, and it lies with the drug addiction and mental health crisis that we do face. Matt and I have testified at the Capitol, and I have been heartened to see that this is a bipartisan issue. We had bills up in the state legislature that passed it didn't make it to the floor, but it passed in committee. Within the different committees. Yes, yeah. Sorry. And one was on performance measures and figuring out how to qualify things and attaching it to funding, but it was also on diversion money, prioritizing towards mental health and drug addiction. And I think that needs to be a priority, cities, local, state, national, and anytime that I see that we fail to do that, we don't do that, and we just look at it as a housing, we really are not solving the issue. And it's just taking us backwards.
No, I mean, I totally agree that there are underlying drivers, and I touched on them with the comorbidities that we talked about earlier, the mental health and substance abuse, and I'd even throw in some what I call like family dynamic issues. And this is when I went on a ride along with the constables, and we heard stories about people that, their family members would drop them off in a different city because they had whatever issues or whatever differences. We heard issues where, there were multi-generational households that somebody kicked somebody else out because of different issues. I mean, just a lot of issues there also. And yeah, obviously mental health, and that a big driver for that, from my opinion, is closing a lot of those institutions in the 1980s and not really having an answer for them. And it's really the same parallel that you just mentioned a moment ago, which is, again, lifting the camping ban and then not having a solution in place for how to address that critical issue. And I share that same perspective. I think that's why so many people were frustrated by it, because it really became, it became an issue that you were bringing people out of the woods, and maybe it was creating some visibility around the issue, and maybe there was some advantage to that, but it was also creating a public safety issue. You had people, essentially camped underneath freeways and under overpasses, and it was dangerous for them, and it was dangerous for the vehicles, and it was dangerous for people that were abutting their neighborhoods. And I heard all kinds of horror stories with feces and drug paraphernalia and mental episodes on people's driveways. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm still hearing those episodes as I talk to voters. So, I think that I understand the perspective of social workers when they say that we've got to put a roof over their head because the problems will only get worse. These mental health and substance abuse problems will only get worse as they're out in the street. But the problem there is then you've got to have what we talked about earlier, the metrics and accountability and so on, to make sure they are getting services and they are getting help, and there is wraparound services or whatever else, so that people can get help, can get that access, and hopefully move on and move forward in their lives. And the people that for whatever reason aren't able to, they can get help in a different way, or we can match them with the right kind of help that we need. You mentioned, different kinds of mental health resources, different kinds of substance abuse resources, but obviously attacking those underlying issues is going to be, from my perspective, paramount, because otherwise you're just talking about a really, 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 really expensive way to house folks. And that's unfair to everybody else that's supporting an operation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Who themselves are struggling to stay in Austin.
Absolutely. Cleo and I went to Seattle for a conference for a coalition that came together called North America Recovers, that had experts from a number of U.S. and Canadian cities. And the goal was to look at public safety and homeless issues in our major cities. And we came away with a kind of a simple motto, which is treatment first, not housing first. Mm-hmm. And I think fundamentally that's
housing earned.
Pardon?
Treatment first, housing earned.
Yeah, housing earned. That's right. That's right. Yes, correct. That's better said. That's actually more accurate. And that's, again, because if think about it this way, Mark, if your child or your close friend or your grandson or someone you cared about had a drug problem and you wanted to help them, yes, you would want them in a safe environment. And contrary to what some people claim about Cleo and I, we want our homeless in safe environments too. But what we also want is for the underlying problem to be directly addressed. And unfortunately, our council, with the exception of Mackenzie and perhaps our mayor, does not agree with required sobriety. And so we don't want to be overly, punitive to this community. We have compassion. We truly do have compassion for the homeless. Many of them are dealing with cycles of abuse. Some of them have been put in these situations due to no fault of their own, with just tragic and sudden circumstances. But trapping them in a generational cycle of victimhood and dependency not only doesn't help them, but to your point, also is not respectful of taxpayers. So, we do want to see people get on the council who are going to have a fresh perspective and are going to focus on, as you said, outcomes, which to me, I think really is a good sign that you care about outcomes, because right now the council isn't measuring outcomes. They measure heads in beds, but not outcomes. But then second is to say, what works? Well, we know Haven for Hope works in San Antonio. We know that Community First Village works. We know that Camp Esperanza works. We know that the Houston example you raised works. We know there's a model in Rhode Island called RAT that works. We know there's a model in Colorado Springs that works. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can actually just double and triple down on the things that have proven to work, and we can step back from the things that clearly aren't working. And that actually is the compassionate position for the homeless, and that is what Cleo and I both believe. Any last comments on homelessness? If not, let's get to a couple other issues which we know are important.
I'll just say this. One of my frustrations with homelessness, and maybe this is a good segue to talk about other issues, Matt, is I think the tenor of the conversation that we have needs to change. If you're not for X solution or Y solution, you are uncompassionate, or you even hate the homeless or unhoused. And I think that needs to change. And I see that not just there, it's YIMBY versus NIMBY on land use issues. It's on, we just attach a label to somebody, and we're not really ready to dig into the things that you just mentioned, which is to say what works in other places, really be thoughtful about comparative policy, and make sure that we're separating out what I would call like the marketing of these different programs and ideas from the actual, the data-driven informed approach of what's working elsewhere and how do we use that, what's working here, how do we build on that, what's not working here, how do we fix and change that, how do we pivot and go in a different direction. So changing those conversations, I think, is going to be really important, and I'd love to be part of that on the council.
Excellent. You mentioned affordability earlier, and it is actually a tragedy that so many people who've lived in Austin for a long time are starting to feel like they can't afford to live here and are being pushed further and further and further from the city center, many of whom still work in Austin, right? And so it's actually creating this disastrous situation where we're forcing people to live further from the city center, putting more cars on the road, traveling longer distances. It's not sustainable. And, one of the ideas that's been put on the table as a way to improve affordability is the so-called home initiative, which as a resident of the district you're running in Northwest Hills, I can tell you is unpopular here. Cleo and I did not get directly involved in that issue. We don't get involved in every issue, but I know that she and I both had concerns about the fact that the home initiative kind of overrode deed restrictions and HOAs in a way that we thought was inappropriate. We all want more housing supply, right? The free market works whether you like the free market or not. And we have a supply issue in our city. We're not building housing fast enough. I know that Mayor Watson had McKinsey do a study, and they've implemented something like 60 of the 65 recommendations on reducing permitting backlogs. But as you look at both the home initiative and affordability, what have you heard? What do you see as real solutions? What's the city doing well? What can the city do better? Because that issue is just getting worse and worse and worse. And city spending and taxes are a huge part of the problem.
Yeah, so I think there's two kind of related points there. One is the one that you just mentioned, I think that we've kind of already danced around, which is I do think that there's a deep connection between what we're asking people, which is essentially a regressive tax, right? Like our utility bills are going to go up 9.5% this year, 30% over up the next 5 years because of a lot of infrastructure that Austin Water is going to be building. Some of which could potentially be built for less dollars, fewer dollars if we changed from, design philosophy, construction management at risk to bid, build. But all to say, there's a lot of city spending that could be reviewed to figure out how does this not become a regressive tax on people that forces them out of being able to afford to stay in Austin. In my community, we have people here that, bought their condos 20 years ago for $150,000, and they're retired, teachers, whatever they are, and they're struggling to stay here. And I have to be sensitive of that, not from just a tax perspective, but even an HOA fee perspective on what's going to make sure that we can keep people here that want to stay here and they don't get driven outside the city or to a different part of the state or country altogether. So that's one piece of it. I think the piece regarding home, I testified 4 times against home. I didn't feel like it was a well thought out plan for a number of reasons. One was infrastructure concerns. We're talking about parking and wastewater and water and tree canopy and, fire safety, flood mitigation, even emergency vehicle access. making sure that if you are changing and adding all this density in the middle of neighborhoods, that you are accommodating all of those different facets that need to support that growth and that level of density. And we didn't really hear that there was a plan for any of that. There was also an equity overlay that they couldn't even get a vote on. So that would have protected people in other parts of town that are at risk of losing their home or being gentrified or displaced. So there were a lot of concerns regarding home. And I think one thing that underpins that entire conversation that really doesn't get enough real thought and discussion is this idea that densifying equals affordability. And I think there's a lot of folks in town that believe that on faith. I've yet to see any real evidence to supporting that. If you think of the densest cities in America, are they the most affordable? You'd probably say, I don't think so.
Right.
I've seen lots of economists. One of my favorite is an economist out of Australia. His name is Dr. Cameron Murray. He's written a book called The Great Housing Hijack. I totally recommend it if anybody's interested in housing issues. And one of the things that Murray talks about is here's this economist in Queensland, and the United Kingdom Office of Innovation reaches out to him. And they say, we've exhausted all of our local resources here and experts. We're trying to find a single example of where changing zoning and densifying has actually made a place more affordable. And he's like, well, you went around the world and I don't have any examples to share with you either. So that's where the state of that research is. And yet we're consistently and almost, I would say, exclusively focusing on that as our solution to the problem. And it's hilarious and tragic at the same time, because there's all kinds of things we could look at. You mentioned permitting earlier. We've embarked on site plan review for large developments, but it's at the medium and small scale development that I think there are real opportunities to decrease the length of permitting and decrease the cost and fees associated with permitting that would hopefully bring houses online quicker and faster with less red tape. That's something I hear across the board from architects and people in that space. That's one opportunity. I think there's talking about short-term rentals and regulating that industry better. That's a place where you've got a very, very small, thin slice of operators that are local, that pay into hotel occupancy taxes, that follow the rules. And the vast majority, I'm talking probably 80 or 90% plus of operators that are out of town, that are treating their property as investment. They don't care about what happens with noise complaints and parking and all kinds of other byproducts of their short-term rentals. I think that's one opportunity because that's potential housing stock. And then I think the last one I would say was just institutional investment in single-family homes. These are people buying homes for cash. They're creating the bubble that we've been living in. This has been investigated by the State House. This is being worked on at a national level. Finally, we're starting to hear more about it. I've been screaming from the rooftops for the last 4 years about this issue, because I do feel like it's driving part of the bubble here in Austin. And if we can get homes back in the hands of actual home buyers and not in the hands of people on Wall Street, I think we can also bring down home prices. So there's a lot of ways to attack this problem. We're just exclusively going after zoning, which again, from my perspective, has very little evidence behind it that's actually going to create more affordable housing. It might create more housing. I'm going to grant that, but the idea that it's going to create more affordable housing is, I think, a fiction that has been widely accepted by a lot of people because it's a very simplistic and convenient solution. But that's not where I think reality lies. And so that's, again, part of the reason I testified. One of the things that I've heard since then from folks in that space, the Info Coalition and people very plugged into development, is, they looked at MLS data and they analyzed it and they said, well, we're really only going to target about 2,000 lots that don't have the deed restrictions and restricted covenants and CC&Rs you alluded to earlier. And if that's the case, why on earth did we upzone 176,000 single-family 1 through 3 lots across the entire city? We could have used a scalpel. We went after it with a sledgehammer. And so thinking about just how to create smart and balanced policy is going to be one of my priorities also. And I think, again, something that's missing from council right now.
I'm really impressed with the substantive responses to quality of life issues, affordability, public safety, homelessness, instead of just this blanket, we need to solve it, we need to pass a contract. You've really spent a lot of time reading and leaning on your life experiences and work experiences. And that really, we need more of that.
Shines through. Yeah, we do. It's a real tribute to the time you've put in, Mark, and the work you've done over 10 years. And in fact, maybe that's helpful. Let's do one more substantive question. But before we do, why don't you just explain, you talked a little bit about it, but you've been involved in campaigns. You're a pretty committed Democrat, even though this is a nonpartisan office. You have a lot of support, it sounds like, from your website I was looking at across the spectrum. I mean, that really is what Northwest Hills and Far West and this district is about, really. I mean, someone that can have that cross-section of support.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things there. One is we had this event last night. It was my, as I call it, my 17th iteration of my 29th birthday. And so one thing my campaign manager, David, mentioned when we were after the event in the parking lot, he said, that was amazing. Not only was that room full, but that was a real cross section. I mean, that was really representative of the district. You had people that were, diehard affordability progressives that were in Tarrytown, and you had people that were also more conservative. And that's who this district is. It's a fairly split district. And I want to make sure everybody is represented, like I said at the beginning of the conversation. In terms of my own background, yeah, I started my career working out of a suitcase, helping elect Democrats up and down the state. I worked in a lot of state house races. We unseated, 5-term incumbents. I lived out of I was in Corpus for a year. I worked in Dallas, Fort Worth. I worked on mayoral stuff in San Antonio. I was all over the place, really trying to make up for lost time in a lot of ways because of some health issues I've had. And that was a great way to get as much information and exposure and experience as possible in a short period of time. I came back, I worked at the State Democratic Party and the Texas Progress Council. And then again, I made a move to just, again, capture as much different experience as possible. I quit entirely. I went back to school. I got an MBA and did some more consulting and then technology work for about 6 years, CRM and ERP solutions and digital strategy and project management. And my real mistake was joining my HOA board in 2014. That's what sucked me back. It's sort of like the last person to say no.
Yeah.
But that's what sucked me back into city issues. And our issue at that time, you might remember this, as the Austin Oaks PUD at the corner of Spices Springs and Mopac.
It was a big fight. Yeah, I grew up near there.
Okay. So yeah, you are probably intimately familiar with it. They were going to build, a campus of 15-story buildings. It's obviously incredibly convenient when you're a council member on the other side of town to be like, oh yeah, that sounds fantastic. We need more XYZ. Let's just do it. But you're not really thinking about the neighbors and the impacts and the infrastructure. And that's been my central challenge. One of my first council races was reelecting Betty Dunkley back in 2005. And one of the things I really, really learned and appreciated from her was she was a former CPA, a former city financial manager. She understood the budget backwards and forwards, which was a real lesson for me that is a incredibly valuable skill set to have and bring to council. And when she was, turned off of council, I'm not sure we've ever had that kind of understanding and advocacy experience. So all have to say, the Austin Oaks PUD, we had an impact analysis showing 50,000 trips per day on Spicewood Springs Road alone. That's the only point of entry and egress from our own community. It's there's a fire station right there on the road, as you know. So it's really important that people can get through that road. And we saw the city's plan. It was to spend $250,000 upgrading 2 intersections. And we said, there's no way that's going to accommodate that level of traffic or be safe for those, the AFD. And so we wound up getting into this really bitter fight. There are people in this neighborhood that still don't talk politics as a result of how it was. But it was that led me to help Allison in 2016 because I felt like she was listening to us on the right side of that issue. And then that again pulled me back. I got involved with the Austin Neighborhood Council. I've been on the executive committee for the last 6 years, getting involved in all manners of issues, including writing and researching information on public safety and homelessness and other land use things. So that's been part of what's helped keep me informed, because one of I think the central challenges we have in the city is informing people about what's going on, giving them just good data, good information, reliable information that's not weaponized or partisanized about issues that impact them, all those quality of life things that we've been talking about. And there are some local papers that do, I think, a good job. There are some affiliates that do a good job. But on the whole, we've seen the Statesman kind of hollowed out over the years. Our main source, we used to have beat reporters there that have been there for decades that understood the city backwards and forwards. That's no longer the case, unfortunately. And so getting people that's how I see the Austin Neighborhood Council and my work there is we work with, anywhere between 60 to 100 neighborhood associations and contact teams, and we're trying to get information out into the hands of residents and homeowners so they understand what's happening to them and they can hopefully get involved. We have a real public engagement problem. That's one reason I started a business after helping Allison, because I realized the data landscape had changed so much since I worked in politics. We've got much richer data sets with issue-oriented and political and demographic and so much richer data that we can target and model and figure out who we need to talk to and how to get them engaged. And so I use that and I help small businesses and nonprofits and advocacy groups and campaigns find customers and voters and donors. And it's important to me. That's my mission, or at least has been, because I feel like there is this major public engagement and public trust challenge. If you look at Pew poll data going back, to the 1950s, people generally used to trust the government across party lines. I mean, we're talking about in the 70s when it was polled. Today, it's in the teens. Nobody trusts government. When you look at the Notley polls from the council the last few years, council's polling in the low 30s, maybe, we just don't trust what's going on. And one of the things I think we've got to do is better communicate what's going on, be real with people, be authentic, and make sure that we can actually deliver services that address their core needs. And if we can do that, I think we can start winning back some trust and hopefully also make progress on those issues.
Yeah, when you said that you got pulled back in, it reminded me of Michael Corleone and Godfather. Just when I thought I was out, they keep pulling me back in.
I use that example. Like, have you heard of Godfather Part 3? Well, it's just like that.
Yeah. Let's ask one more substantive thing, in case there's anything else you want to talk about, because you talked about density. And look, I think on some level, we all understand that people are coming to Austin. Austin's growth is only going in one direction. And we have to have places for those people to live. We have to have ways for people to get around. We have to have enough grocery stores and fire stations and all the things we need. How closely have you studied Project Connect? Because, sort of my own view on this is I'm pro mass transit, but I'm anti mass transit that doesn't work for a city. And whether you liked Project Connect when you voted on it, whenever that was 5 years ago, is irrelevant, because the project is now very different. And we've been spending a massive amount of money on a project that's now basically 1/10 what it was when it was sold to the voters. And so to me, I don't know why you build the whole system. Maybe you just start with downtown to the airport, or the domain to downtown, or the domain to the airport. Houston did that. They did it one piece at a time rather than the whole thing. They screwed up the first part, they fixed it, and then they earned the trust of the voters so that they could do the additional pieces. Right. So there's a lawsuit, there's questions, there's some opposition. 300,000 Austinites were going to be displaced by Project Connect had the initial plan ever come into existence. I imagine your district probably doesn't think Project Connect will benefit them. I know I certainly don't feel that way here, but have you studied the project? Do you have an opinion on kind of where we are now? Because in my view, we need a much better plan than what we have right now if we're going to do something that's going to cost that much money, have those property tax increases, have the debt load that puts in our city.
Here's what I've been saying in the campaign trail, which is we need a mass transit, or maybe even a combination of mass transit solutions that are flexible, that are economical, and that can be deployed quickly to get cars off the road and help move people. And when I think about that criteria, the challenge with Project Connect is it's not any of those. You're talking about one line being deployed in 2033. You're talking about, to your point, it was, I think, intentionally misscoped by Randy Clark, who's now,
in DC. Yeah.
So we're talking about a lot of challenges with a project that I think has already lost a lot of trust in the public and really doesn't come anywhere close to West Austin, where I think we do need transit options, more transit options. We've got really like about 3 bus routes that come out here at Terrytown and Far West and Great Hills. And really that's it. And I think people are hungry for transit options, like, as you say, and they're hungry to be able to, shed a vehicle or, have different ways of getting around town. But we're not there yet because we've invested all of our eggs into one really expensive basket. And that to me is a challenge. I don't know what will happen with the future of Project Connect. It may as you say, there's a challenge with the funding mechanism. There's challenges with it being misscoped. I think one option would be to have it go back to voters and make sure they're still on board with the current incarnation of it. But in terms of other options, I'm a lot more excited about bus rapid transit. There's 2 lines that should be starting next year. It gives you an indication of how much cheaper. Those are going to be largely federally funded lines. We're gonna have a good window then soon to figure out whether that's a good solution for Austin, whether we can deploy it in other places, potentially even including West Austin in District 10, and whether it can start moving people at the way that we hope. My understanding is from visiting with various folks in the space that it was when Randy Clark actually came here, it was his initial preference. And then he got pulled into the light rail camp because of capacity issues. And I would say even if light rail does have better capacity over time, you're talking about having to project out into 2045 and 2050 to see those benefits. And that's a long time where a lot of things can happen. And I work in spaces where we have to plan for multiple contingencies. We've just experienced COVID and a pandemic and seen how that impacts mass transit. We've seen us drop down from the 10th largest to the 11th largest city because of a lot of issues. Anything can change in this town. And for us to be planning to that degree and expecting this to be, everything to go right in 25 plus years, I think we need, frankly, better planning and more solutions and having a multi-pronged approach. And so I see bus rapid transit as a real opportunity. I see what's called on-demand transit. That would be everything from expanding our existing pickup service, which currently in District 10, I think only serves Tarrytown, to other neighborhoods. I think and then building on that to make sure this has been deployed, not from my understanding in a city as large as Austin, but in various small and medium-sized cities here in America. It's been deployed in larger cities, I think, across the pond in Europe. So that's an option that I think, and one thing that's great about on-demand transit is it's equitable. Anybody can access it. It's even more flexible than BRT in the sense that it doesn't matter where you live. It doesn't matter what income bracket you are. You can use the app. You can call for a vehicle. It'll get there and it'll take you to where you need to go. It also solves this last mile issue that we've got with rail that we don't talk about much.
Yeah. And scooters aren't the answer to the last mile problem. I think we know that now.
Well, my understanding is we're not even doing a good job of capturing the data on scooters and the traffic injuries and accidents that are resulting from that. And so, again, I'm very much a metrics and data informed person. And I want to make sure that we are using the transit options that I think that's a major criteria for whatever we do is ensure that we've got the ridership support the option. It was frustrating to me with home that the logic changed during council over time. It morphed from once they realized their affordability argument fell through, they were like, well, we need home to make sure that we've got the density for the federal funding for the Project Connect. And I remember asking council and the mayor in these meetings, a lot of things seem to have to go right. Help me understand what's going on. Help explain this play, because so many things have to go right. We've got to, first of all, avoid any kind of downturns, pandemics, bubbles. We've got to make sure that we've got, this requisite level of density to qualify for the federal funds that we may or may not get, that we've got, and then we've eventually got the ridership that we need to support the thing. So many things have to go right. And that's why I kind of characterize it as putting all of our eggs into a very expensive basket, where I feel like, look, if we can already get BRT online in just a matter of years, and where places like Indianapolis and Nashville are already doing successfully, then let's have that conversation instead and start getting that up and running. And you know what? If Project Connect is a piece of that also, if the light rail system is a piece of that too, then that's great. But those are things where we can start making a change and impact right now for a fraction of the cost, for not disrupting businesses, not having to kick out Dirty Martins and whoever else. There are a lot of options for us to consider. And the frustration is really that, again, it's this very binary conversation. You're either for or against it. And to your point, like, I'm also for mass transit. My mom was an architect and planner. My grandfather was an architect and planner. I get it. But it's making sure, like, I'll just say one last thing, and I know I'm carrying on here. if this were any other space that you worked in, that you managed, and somebody came to you and said, wow, this project has increased, has been totally misscoped. It's now 5x or whatever it is, the cost that it was even just 3 years ago, you would say, hang on a second. Let's back up the truck. Let's reevaluate what's going on. Let's figure out if this still makes sense or whether we need to pivot and go in a different direction.
Yeah, I think it's a 1.5 times overall cost. But when you do the ridership, it is probably a 5 or 10x because I think it's 1/10 the ridership they initially promised. Cleo, any last? Yeah,
6 line to 1 lines.
Yeah, that's right. Cleo, any last
No,
issues you want to get into? Yeah.
I know. I just want to say, as a moderate Democrat, I appreciate how you see things not as binary, in regards to any of the issues that we've discussed. It's a more bigger worldview of looking at where things can be done better and seeking solutions. And I really appreciate that. I wish you well. And I appreciate the courage and your energy to do this. It's not an easy thing. We've been through these for several years, Matt and I, and we always appreciate when community members, say, you know what, I need to be a part of the solution, because obviously no one in my district is doing a really good job of with the issues that are at the forefront for my community. So I really appreciate that.
No, thanks so much for your words of encouragement. And yeah, it is tougher than I thought. I've been on the other side of it so many times as a manager and volunteer and consultant, and it's definitely given me a lot more empathy. And for folks that run, I think it's a huge undertaking. And one of the things that's crazy to me is you look back 4 years, 8 years, 10 years ago for this seat, you had 6 to 8 people that ran. This has become a very undesirable job, to the best that I can tell. And I'm just incredibly grateful. I've got a really great team behind me, a lot of folks in the district that have been behind me from day one that I've worked with, and they're the ones that are really powering the campaign, not me. And we're just going to keep pushing for the next 2 months to win this thing.
That's awesome.
And people, and I just for the record, we have invited your opponent. There's only 2 people running in this district this election now. The filing period's closed. So Ashika Rangul has also been invited by email. We absolutely love to have a conversation with her if she's open to that. Your website is Marc, M-A-R-C, 4FOR, Austin.com. Any other ways people can get involved or things that you need at this point?
Lots of things. Obviously, everybody's support and vote, incredibly grateful for. If you know folks in the district that I can reach out to, that's helpful. Getting signs out, hosting events is all helpful in the community. Contributions are incredibly welcome. We've got to raise another $40,000 to meet our goals. We've already raised over 70. And so lots of ways to help. And obviously just, volunteering, knocking on doors, making phone calls, helping us write postcards, sending emails to your neighbors. All of those things are incredibly valuable. And so I love to have people get involved in the campaign. All of it's deeply, deeply appreciated.
That's awesome.
Marc, thanks for this time. Thanks for your willingness to step up and serve our city. Thanks for all the things you've been involved in so far. We look forward to getting to know you better. I wish you the very best going forward.
No, I really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation and have a dialogue, and hopefully we can have more of these going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.